In today's show, we'll be discussing chaplaincy and hospice. Um, I gave a presentation in relation to the role of a chaplain in the medical context, and Diana, who is been doing hospice, hospital, and the doula work, and I are building a collaboration to be able to communicate the importance of hospice. So the beginning of my presentation starts like this. According to my friend James Maina, who has done bereavement, chaplaincy, and missionary work, spirituality is a personal quest and a journey which explores what involves in becoming human. It is the essential dimension which brings meaning to life. It is a transcendental force that all religions can subsume because it can move a person forward beyond the narrow boundaries of existence. So the reason that definition for spirituality is important is because another term for chaplain is to call someone a spiritual caregiver, a spiritual care counselor. The more interfaith the group you're part of, the more they call it spiritual care versus pastoral care. But Diana, what do you think? Do you think there's a way to communicate spirituality without offending religious folks?
I think there is. I think religious people they just have to understand how their religion embraces spirituality, because a lot of times religious people have been mostly taught by their religion in a very, religions all have to have their own kind of like Sunday school. So they have to have a very like pedagogical approach. And so a lot of people that are religious, they want to make sure, they want to feel secure that they aren't being pulled away from that by embracing spirituality. They also have to be told that we are, as humans, which it so beautifully was defined in that definition you just read, that our human experience is that we are three-part beings. We are mind, body, and spirit. When people are reminded of these realities, then they can feel more comfortable about spirituality. And they don't feel like they're being led away from what they have been taught. People are afraid. We have been really taught to go by the schooling. We're very tied to schooling, what has been taught to us. And spirituality seems very free-flowing. But once we let people know that spirituality is encased in what you have been taught, then they can feel more comfortable.
I attended a class by a progressive rabbi, and he was saying that religion is like the body of faith, like it's the cocoon or the outer shell, and the spirituality is the soul. And he compared it to hippie theology or hippie worldview is very free-flowing, but it loses its containment. It's kind of all over the place. Yeah. And then traditionalist religious perspectives are very contained, but they lack their passion. So that a healthy form of faith would be one that has both. That has the community element with the religion and the accountability to traditional forms of worship and text, but it also has the personal passion and the personal devotion that makes it worthwhile and exciting. So you have to have both if you want to have a healthy faith. But there are people who have religion without spirituality or spirituality without religion. And I feel that sometimes even the term spirituality can be off-putting for people that have had bad experiences in any type of faith community, even the ones that are the most free-flowing and open, have made people feel that it's silly that talking about being moved by the spirit or having some type of candles and meditation thing doesn't really speak to them. And there are other religions that are more intellectual they kind of frown on this, charismatic style of pursuing God. But as spiritual care providers, we have to be able to help people navigate all those different modes and talk about how their faith informs their experience. So did you experience when you were doing clinical pastoral education where the supervisor were trying to mold you to become more like them, in the sense of if you came in too traditionalist, they try to make you more almost like spiritist, and if you were too free-flowing, they try to make you a little more ingrained and clerical? Did you experience that?
Yeah, I did experience the get out of the box, kind of thing, and be more open. And so I think I had two good supervisors who really wanted us to be balanced, who felt like stay in your tradition, but try not to box everyone in it, and be of service to people and be where they are. As you were saying, we have to meet people where they are. We have to see where people are and ground them. Some people need grounding because they're too up there in the spiritual and they want grounding. And some people who are too grounded, they want a little bit more freedom to know more the mystic element, more the spiritual element. But I would say that I felt in my CPE experience that there was also not enough cautioning of balancing this out. It was more just don't proselytize, but there wasn't a sense of find your balance, find out how you can be of service. There was a little bit more of be cautious that you're not proselytizing, but not enough of really seeing where we can go creatively or how we can meet people beyond the don't proselytize. There wasn't a whole lot of, guidance in that area, in my program, in my specific experience.
So
yeah.
Something else that I said was that another way to look at spirituality is to view it as a relationship or connection, which brings about a sense of emotional and physical well-being. So I had never thought about it like that, where what makes someone spiritual is they connect with either nature, other people, or with God, and that makes it a relationship that you have, an ongoing conversation with what gives you strength or hope. Is that what makes you feel comfortable in a multi like a pluralistic society, where you're not only ministering to fellow Christians in your case or fellow Catholics, you're ministering to anyone who has a sense of hope and a sense of reaching out to the forces of the universe that make us human?
Well, I find that people like that. They like that the spiritual practice, the candles. But I also find that people have this intrinsic need for grounding. And what I mean by grounding is they want to feel safe about these practices. In other words, when you have people who have too many, light a candle, bring a crystal, these are practices, and they might help you feel connected, but there's also a sense of grounding. And by grounding, I mean that people appreciate feeling that they're part of a tradition that's perennial. There's been wisdom, there's been teaching, there's been a connectivity that I guess it goes back to the teaching that's been transmitted generations and generations, and ancestors and teachers. I think people like to feel that what they're experiencing, even if it's free flowing, it has a base, it has a grounding. So even if I'm ministering to people, whether they're Christian or Catholic, they like to feel like what their practices are, if they're kind of removed from church and tradition, they want to feel a grounding and like what they're doing belongs to something ancient. There's something about us humans that feels grounded in ancient and tradition. I don't care how, and I'm a very progressive thinking person, and yet I need to feel grounded in a tradition too. I can't disconnect from it. I need a grounding to help me in the practices that may be loose or loose is not the best word, that may be more abstract, you know, like lighting a candle. For example, I was looking at some of the saints in my tradition. We have a saint that's a beekeeper. She's a patron saint of beekeeping. And, you know, there was a patient who was Catholic and she kept bees. You know, how interesting, and she could have a ritual, a spiritual practice of the beekeeping and kind of united to the tradition of this saint. And so again, you see that she can go out and do this kind of new practice or a ritual that serves her, but it's grounded in this tradition, grounded in something that happened, you know, centuries ago. There's something about an ancient knowledge that helps us to feel secure. That's what I have witnessed, that's what I have experienced, that people need.
Something else I brought up, and this comes from my experience in advocacy, is that they call it survivor or client-based care. So when you're working with people who have experienced trauma or who need specific services and social services, you want to make it based on them, not based on what you think that they need. So it's almost like empowering people versus top-down approach.
Yes.
So I was saying that the best chaplains are the ones that do this type of care, that is, you let them inform what you're planning to do versus you going in with an agenda. How important do you think that is, especially when people are vulnerable, when people are in their deathbed or super sick, that we don't try to hit all the points or perform an assessment that makes them uncomfortable? Like I've been around situations where you almost become an interrogator, where you just want that we think that to give someone better service, we have to know if they were you know, baptized, confirmed, and married through a particular community, to then be able to say, okay, well, now I know where they're coming from. Sometimes you don't get to find out about their religious upbringing until later, or even after they pass, you find out how involved they were in their community. Do you think that sometimes we fall into the trap of becoming a little too inquisitive, to the point of becoming inquisitors versus being fellow sojourners and just walking with them wherever they're at?
I think I think it serves us best to be patient led and really listen. I really think that a lot of CPE needs to really, rather than focus it on don't proselytize, I think it should do more of learn how to listen. We're in a culture that's toxic and just full of, we come from a debate, you know, the marketplace of ideas in America, which ideas are going to be best. So we're in a vocal culture. We're in a very much what I have to say. That's just the nature of the culture. So sacred work, spiritual support work is listening to the soul, is witnessing, it's seeing a person where they are. And honestly, if you just trust in that listening, you trust that you will hear, you will see, you will really see the person. And what starts to happen when you really listen to someone, the patient intuits. You're transmitting this energy of I see you, I hear you, I sense you, I see your soul. And that person just kind of opens up and you get everything you need. And the person listens to themselves telling you something they didn't know. So a lot of times you think you have the wisdom, but when the patient sees themselves being heard, they actually listen to themselves, because they're also not on the defense. They're also not, you know, they're also defenses down, and truth comes out. Truth that they didn't even see about themselves can come out when you offer that listening. So I think CPE programs need to invest more on how to listen and less on how to do a whole lot of other things, or how to communicate your faith or be pastoral. I think being pastoral is listening, or being a spiritual care provider is, how do you see a spirit? If you're caring for the spirit, how do you treat a soul? How do you see a spirit? How do you deal with a spirit, with a person's spirit? You just listen, you listen to it. And when you listen to someone's soul, which is very hard work, it means the spiritual care provider needs to be very silent. You're almost like in a meditative, you're listening as if that person in front of you is sacred. It's like you're contemplating, really. And that person senses it. And it's amazing what you transmit and how they open up, because you were able to see them like nobody else has seen them. And they'll hear themselves say things they didn't know they thought, because nobody had ever given them the space to say it. They're like, oh, I didn't know I thought that. And they're their own medicine, because all you offered was, you really became a sounding board. So whatever they threw out at you was what they needed. The medicine they needed was in there all along. And I just find that we, hopefully a good CPE supervisor will really train. I took some courses on my own on sacred listening. I bought a book on sacred listening. It's a practice that I think all spiritual care providers need, more listening. For some reason, we fear that, or we think we need to be talking. That's just the way our culture is. It's just we're in a very dialogue-y, debatey, opinionated. That doesn't serve. That's not the way the spiritual care works. Not primordially. No. We work by listening, and that's very hard. It's hard. It's hard work.
I thought they did a good job with the clinical aspect of empathic listening versus just, again, coming in with a plan or trying to persuade someone to feel a certain way. Yeah. I thought that was the greatest thing that I learned when I was in CPE. But yes. How would you describe meaning making to someone who's new to this field? Helping a patient find meaning in their experience, even something as terrible as a dying diagnosis.
I think meaning making is, really listen. First, that person has to learn to trust you, so they can have a confidence that you're going to hold a container. The spiritual care provider has to make a container in the visit so that the person can make meaning. But a lot of times people are afraid to make meaning because they're afraid that how they interpret events, they're afraid to scare you. So I think a spiritual care provider has to be strong and show the patient that they're strong enough to hold whatever comes, because people are, some of the patients are fearing they're dying. They're extremely anxious. Some of them may even relate that they're seeing their dead loved ones. They're seeing, I had a patient who was seeing a figure behind me, and he was kind of going on about what he was dying. Obviously, had a lot of the drugs or however he wanted, but how he interpreted that. I had to stay strong, and I didn't have to make meaning for them. But I would ask him, who do you see? And who do you think that is? And do you know why they're here? Or, these are very tough things. Of course, I in the beginning, I was a little scared, but I had to learn that I had to create a container for them. And even when there weren't these, I know I went straight into some kind of a mystical thing, but even if it's just somebody fearing death and they're just frustrated, letting them know that you're mature enough to handle and safe enough for them to throw however they're making meaning. And a lot of good questions. It's not telling the person, it's asking them. I think this is where the second thing would come, other than empathetic listening or sacred listening. The art of asking really good questions is what will really serve a good chaplain. So making meaning can't happen if a chaplain isn't tuned in and asking a really good question based on what they're what they're sensing, and intuition plays a big part, you know. Asking the person to define this, and why would you say you're feeling a certain way, or what does that mean to you, or, you know, just asking good questions. And I think a lot of times people come in thinking that you have to have answers or that you have to give them something. Not really. Asking a good question does lead us to making very meaningful conversations, and starting with a question, and knowing too that the questions don't have to be answered, but that the questions themselves may provide a sense of something for the patient to hang on to and think about and go to, and, you know, and learn to be comfortable with questions. That's what I think as far as meaning making. I have found that it's helped by very good questions. Very good questions.
Well, part of it is kind of repeating what they say in a summary, like that you understand what they're saying, and then asking a question that goes further or deeper into their thoughts. So that ability to be a student of their experience is what makes people open up, because you're in tune with what they're saying. If you are asking random questions that have nothing to do with what's going on, or you take them outside of the room, as our supervisor would say, you got to keep them in the room, keep them focused on their experience. And people will do it just because it's too overwhelming. They'll start asking you, like, tell me about your kids, or tell me about where you're from, to try to like get themselves out of a painful conversation.
Right.
But to be able to roll them back in and to keep them engaged, that I think that takes a lot of skill. One thing, when I was at the Veterans Hospital, they took us to the healthcare, it's like mental health authority building from the city, and they had a chaplain there. They would talk about unassailable beliefs, and I think it's strange that you would bring that up with people who have mental challenges, because it's almost like too deep of a thing or too hard of a concept. But the idea is that going back to what we were saying about trying to mold you into the perfect chaplain, or to a more interfaith style chaplain, that they would question your unassailable beliefs, or the things that you're not willing to give up. So to me, it's like biblical perspectives are very important. So if you start defining God away from the biblical ideas, then you end up with a different type of religious perspective. So to me, there are a lot of things that you can debate. There's a lot of things that you can kind of wonder about, but there are some foundational things that are very important, and those things inform your experience. So if you get hit by a car and you have this deep love for God, the first thing you're going to ask is for God to help you, to get you out of that. But if you don't have any particular belief in God, then you're just going to focus on something else, or on your family, or on yourself, to be able to overcome it. So I think being aware of people's unassailable beliefs, such as the God's constancy, or the idea of love in a spiritual sense, something like that, can help chaplains know where the conversation is heading. So I often ask people, what is God telling you right now? And that's my way of kind of probing their view of God.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you say, well, God is telling me that I've been a bad boy, or that, you know, he's going to get me, or something like that, then you know that they have a punitive view of God that might not be helping them. Or even like a magical view of God, that God is like a genie that gives them everything they want. So have you ever come across that idea of trying to find out people's unassailable beliefs, to be able to kind of measure where they're at in their faith, and which aspects of their faith can be positive or negative as they deal with their illness?
Yeah, I think you're saying it correctly. I believe people have their own belief of what God is. God could be my intuition, inner self, on that sense. God is my eternal value system. So I do ask people that, and of course, it always goes back to, you have to see where they're at too, and honor where they're at. If they're not ready to accept, for example, some people don't believe in a great being that is a divinity. They believe that God is your intuition, or God is an inner, a sense of self, a sense of, that may not be a person. Yeah, and I think we always have to make a location for that. I think that's important. That's very important. And for them to, as we were saying earlier, for them to guide themselves, because that's their North Star, regardless of how I agree with it or don't agree with it, or agree. They have a location, they have a geography, they have an internal, everybody has an internal inner landscape, and that North Star that's pointing them to some transcendent value. Unless they're purely atheistic, and even they have, even I've had patients that were atheists and they have spirituality, they have a transcendence, and they believe in space, music, the cosmos, the universe. So seeing that internal inner landscape, I would call it I guess that's my language, or that inner language of where are they located? Where is their landscape? Where is their spirit located? What is that zone? And yeah, finding where they are and helping them find that is definitely going to help them to help themselves as they navigate through very difficult human questions. Absolutely, they have to find that.
So you mentioned that we're mind, body, and spirit. What are the intersections where chaplains get involved in the mind or the emotions? Because that is something that sometimes can be confused, where people make it in compartments. So the doctors handle the body, the psychologist, social worker handles the psyche, and then we
Yeah.
handle the spirit. But
Yeah.
how much of the spirit is the mind, and how much of the mind is the body? Like, how can you just throw a human being around without realizing that all those things are connected?
I think I think our role represents, I think our role and our presence, and at least in the hospice experience, it's demonstrated, because they see the doctor, and the doctor has a language, and the doctor has an approach, and then they see different peoples in different roles. So I think in a hospice that is very partial. There's a lane for that, and I think the patients see it. And I don't think that's hard for them. I don't think it's hard for them. I think that dynamic is a little more blurred and confused by the providers than by the patients. I think the patients see it, and I think they know when they see me as a chaplain, they know that we're going to go into deep existential human experience, how I'm dealing with transcendence, the divine, God. They know that already because they see a different person. So in a hospice context, I think it's very easy identifiable. I think it's more blurred when we're dealing with the team ourselves. I think that's where the dynamics can get a little bit more confused. But I think the patients get it. I think the patients know, I need to ask you this, or I need to ask a social worker that, or I mean, at least in my experience as a hospice chaplain, I think they know exactly my role, and they know what they need to address with me. That's been my experience. But where I have more of a challenge with the organization and the institution knowing my role, I feel not the patients.
And then something I said is that if you get thrown into a crisis situation, we have a set of tools that we bring that other providers might not have. So
Yeah.
I always criticize chaplains who think they have all the answers, and they want to be theologians more than compassionate caregivers. So they come and they explain what heaven is, and they come and explain, all these things. But when you're in a crisis situation, the way that we provide comfort is by giving them hopeful things that speak to them. So I have no bones about quoting Bible passages that I think are important. So, talking about God not abandoning us, or that healing can come in many ways, like things that are concrete. Because
Yeah.
if someone is hurting and I say, well, what do you think it is? Then they're going to be more lost, because they're going to say, what are you doing here if all you're going to do is give me more questions and more conundrums to solve? But if we can give them a glimpse of something that they can relate to, such as, a passage that says, God is faithful to those that seek him, or,
Yeah.
um, you know, if you seek God, you will find him, or something like that, that they, it gives them those anchors, like something to carry them through in that difficult moment. A social worker or a doctor might give them something else. They might give them a med, or they might give them some
A
resource,
resource.
like, you're having a mental breakdown here, talk to these people. But we actually have all of our resources at our disposal, which is our knowledge of scripture, or our interest in meditation and guided meditation to get people to get grounded. So I feel that that's what I like about chaplaincy, is that I don't have to depend on anybody else to be able to do my work. When I get put in a situation, I can hold my own with my abilities, which is to support, to be kind, to love on someone, and I don't have to be calling on the shelter to see if they have space, or to be chasing around, a doctor to try to get a recipe for someone. Do you feel like that? That you feel like confident and capable with all those tools, and that they come handy when you need them the most?
I do, because one of my tools is that I ready the space to. There's a writer that I really like. She's a death doula, and she wrote a book called Death Nesting. So she envisioned death as you build a nest. You don't just die. You begin to, when it's the season, family, they begin to build a nest container, but it's actually more of a loving, it's a nest. The practice among holistic doula care is death nesting. En español es arrollando la muerte. It's like there's a feeling of when a mother hen comes and she begins to make a loving nest. And one of the things I do with my patients is to create a loving environment to invite the next transition, the death. And I always tell them, remember this, because in our culture, every time we are presented with death, it's a fire truck, an ambulance, and the police, there's like red lights and blink and ERs. That's how our culture has met death. And it's so unfortunate. It's been removed from when people would prepare their dead in their homes, in the parlors. And now death has been handed over to the professionals. And how do the professionals get people's bodies out? The police, 911, the fire department, and all these red lights flashing. So one of the things I do with my clients is I'm always death nesting. And this is where the doula approach comes my tool from my toolbox, being a doula and an end-of-life educator, is that I make a nest. And to say death is a process, not an emergency. And I hear myself say this to many clients over time. I don't walk in there, but I always tell them, death is not an emergency. Don't be afraid. It's an event. It will happen. And I say it as it's the right time, as I'm always tending death. I'm not theologian. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm a sacred listener. I'm tending death in that environment. And some of the things that I tell, if the patient isn't ready or the patient isn't, one of the things I tell the family is prepare the atmosphere, tend to make it as loving as possible, put beautiful pictures, light up candles, make it the most loving environment, beauty, open windows, bring as much beauty into the room, memories, music. So I'm tending. death. And so I remember I had this one family where they sort of took on that they were not religiously affiliated, and so they were really appreciated more that holistic doula approach, and they did that. And you know, when their loved one passed on, he had a lung cancer. You know, that sure enough, fire truck came. You know, which has to do, or I don't, ambulance actually. You know, all the big glaring official vehicles that came noisy. And you know what, I remember the wife told me, I'm so glad you prepared me. I'm so glad that you really prepared me, because when I saw the police, I actually told, you know, that I actually went out there because they were so noisy, and I told them, shh, hush, he's dead. You know? So she actually went out there and told them, come in quietly, you know, it's not an emergency. And so she was able to like take ownership of that space, and instead of, oh my God, he's dead, you know, which is like, what, why, you know, that shouldn't, no one, we should be tending to death and making sure it's a beautiful passage, not screaming, not, oh my God, it's not a medical event, although it is, it's a spiritual event. And it's also a new birth. And we go through that process of death tending and nesting a death. And I think that's extremely beneficial to people. And so they're not in a state of emergency. The medical team, for some reasons, a lot of times seems to be like, oh, you know, 911 and, you know, and the payload call. And I've had, you know, managers calling me freaking out. I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. It was coming. You know, and I think the team that I work with, they began to kind of diffuse that sense of urgency, you know, because the clients that I was speaking with, we were already tending and making nest for death. And that's kind of strange, but that's the best way to approach it, and with beauty, with waiting for it, tending to it, and it becomes very beautiful. It's not an emergency with 911 and police. And I tried to go there as a more of a facilitator for that tending, rather than some official clergy chaplain or whatever. You know, I tried to have a softer tending for it. And death nesting is that idea of preparing for it and making sure death is not an emergency. Death is part of life. It's too bad that in our culture, as I was saying, is met with these red lights and loud emergency vehicles. It's a sad thing. Our culture seems to meet death that way. You know, it's not. It can be a beautiful event. I was just watching a picture somebody put on the hospice group. They put a picture of a woman dying. She's passing away from cancer, and her husband's holding her hand. And that's the most beautiful thing any family can witness. That's where you really see that death is not a horrible event that's just so full of tragedy. You're seeing two people who have been married 58 years, loving each other. It's just the most beautiful. People are offering their last act, their last offering. They're offering their death. They've offered their lives to many causes, raising families, jobs. Now they're offering their death. Now, how beautiful can that be? And you just find these amazing scenes of, you know, husbands holding wives or wives holding husbands, and they become absolutely beautiful scenes of love. And people are leaving the planet in the most beautiful way. And it's just our culture needs so much of that. But this is one of the reasons I love chaplaincy so much, you know, because of the beauty you see in many deaths. And it's to transmit that and send that message to the culture is part of what we should do, as long as we don't burn ourselves out, and we remain full of hope. We remain full of hope, and that what we do isn't just artwork, but that it is it's actually nesting, a very beautiful thing, a beautiful transition. Yeah.
Well, part of the dying process is to instill hope in people. And in my group that I facilitate with people who lost someone in the military, we went around the room and everybody was saying, well, I have hope and hope this and hope that. And I actually looked up the definition of hope because it was getting kind of
Yeah.
nebulous. Like,
Yeah.
what the heck is hope? That everybody's always talking about hope. And
Yeah.
it was saying something like the desire for something great to come in the future. And it's like, well, you can have all the desire you want, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. So for me, I talk a lot about ultimate hope, and
Yeah.
it's either heaven or resurrection. But um, I also try to talk about hope based on previous experiences. And in the Bible it says, "Wait upon the Lord," and then it talks a lot about God delivering people, but it's based on remembering that He delivered you in the past. So for people that don't have a faith, I talk about resilience, and I say, what kind of challenges have you been able to overcome, and do you feel like you'll be able to do the same now?
Mm.
So instead of waiting on God to save them, how can the human spirit or their own um, strength can get them through?
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with death, you're dealing with like a final
Final. Mhm.
situation. And of course, if you believe in the afterlife, you feel that this is not you finish the race, but there's more to it. How do you encourage someone and give them hope when it's a hopeless situation? It's a terrible death, and there's also no sense of their essence living on. What aspects of hope would you focus on to make it a healing experience versus kind of a dreadful, just and like it's just it's
Bleak.
over.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference between hope and optimism. And optimism is the way you were saying, as people were exchanging around the room. I hope this, or I hope it doesn't rain tonight. Or I hope I eat pizza tomorrow. That's optimism. That's a kind of wishful thinking. But hope is what I think you were referring to earlier. It's an unassailable Bible belief. I think we can clash, theologians, we can clash about doctrines and theology, but hope is a place, hope, faith, charity, those are places where we have common ground. I think hope, again, is I think you have to be a very good archaeology, and really, if you're presented a very bleak death or very bleak demise, my experience, and I'm speaking for me, I always try to excavate the what I'm extracting from the visit. There's always hope. There's always hope in my, but then again, I have to be very attentive, and I have to that's my work as a spiritual care provider, to find that hope. Not optimism, not wishful thinking, not trying to be Pollyanna and see it positively when it isn't, but trying to find the hope, meaning what will ultimately, where is there hope in this situation? And so if I've done my homework as a spiritual care provider, and I'm paid attention to the family story, I'm paying attention to the past, the present, and the future, I'm going to find an artifact there that's going to have where they can find hope. As I said earlier, and I know Henry Nouwen, who's one of my favorite spiritual writers, he talked about the grace of dying. And in the grace of dying is where you offer your death. And so one of the things that I do is, as people become, they're facing these dark passages, is how are you offering your death? If we can get to that conversation, and many times we can, what are you offering in your death? And how are you offering your death as a gift? That's always hopeful for everyone. I haven't found anyone who hasn't found that. And again, a good spiritual care provider is excavating where that hope is. And again, hope is something that is deeply founded in biblical values, in afterlife. And if it isn't, if the person you're dealing with doesn't have those, then in what their legacy is and what they're leaving their future, and so there's hope. There's always hope. I guess I'm not an optimist, but I'm a hopeful person, because I understand hope. It's just a whole different thing. It's a deeper, it's an unassailable, I think, as you're saying. Yeah.
And the one thing that has become my motto or my tagline is that people want to be uh, heard, understood, and loved. And that is the ultimate aspect of helping someone either in the dying process or sick or just in counseling in general. And that is very unique to the chaplain role because, you know, some people might not feel comfortable talking about loving on a patient in the sense of expressing God's love or appreciating their uniqueness and how special they are. But this idea of having this empathic support, like you hear people when you truly care and you want to support them in the most like selfless way. I think that's something that we have to always consider. You know, there are times that you almost get attached to your families or your patients, and you want to go see them because it makes you feel good to spend time with them. But true empathy is to give them what they need at the right time and
Yeah.
not put yourself in the way, and to really and even connect them with other people that might be able to provide them better care instead of you if needed. And then understanding them to me is a validation that if someone tells you their experience, you're not going to debate them and say, well, do you really think that happened?
Right.
Or, you know, I can see how you thought that's what happened, but, what are the true facts or whatever. Like, that's not our job. Again, we don't investigate. We honor their story and
Yes.
we accept what they're saying to give them, you know, it's weird to say to accept what they're saying, but it's to give them acceptance, to like make them feel, um, validated and and cared for. And then back to the thing about love is like, to me, love is unconditional acceptance. That you don't hold back and that you are in the moment with them. That you're not just looking at them like a subject. Like we have this guy who has cancer and he's elderly, and they become a case or they become, um, the person that you are trying different things on. That they're
Yeah.
they're a valuable human being. So you mentioned sacred listening.
Yeah.
So that we have a role to um, bring out the sacredness in people. And even when they feel crummy and when their body's falling apart, that there is something, there's like a precious uh, uh, thing that they have, and that is their divine spark.
Oh, 1,000,000%. I mean, I was with a patient who was, I think, pretty much on his way out. And I had this disengagement with him, and it was like his soul just came out. And then it was like the next few visits, it was like it spiraled down, and there wasn't a whole lot of positive communication. He became combative and anger. But I have to believe that that moment, that was who he was, his true self. It was that other person that sang and embraced his talent and embraced his beauty and his life. And so we also have to be very careful that we see the lights and the darks in people, even especially because when you're in end of life and you're in an illness, um, your balance as a person is really off kilter, and all of a sudden, or what a psychologist could say bipolar, I guess. But in a spiritual way, I think of it more dark and light, their darkness, their shadow. And I think we have to be able to, where maybe psychology is saying you're bipolar or they're bipolar, though they need psychiatric medicine. I think one of the things that we have as spiritual care providers is that we can see it as lights and darks, and see that that person is neither the light and is neither the dark. They're a beautiful spirit. We don't pathologize, which I think is beautiful about spiritual care providers, that we're not pathologizing people. We're really seeing the true human. Where other disciplines have to, perhaps, I'm not judging that, or that's as that bad or negative, but they in essence have to kind of, I guess, pathologize or say, well, that's a deviation or a disorder. I think what's beautiful about spiritual care is we can hold space for non-judgment and say, I see the dark and I see the light. That's just the human spirit attempting to resolve its own issues. And we can give people hope, where other disciplines do it too, but again, they have to stay more stricter with diagnosis and on and on. But I think our role as spiritual care providers is to have people see their beauty, even when they're hearing psychology or hearing diagnosis, whether they're medical or psychological. They could still see from us as hope, as you have lights, you have darks, and all of us do, and you're resolving these things, and yet you're beautiful. I think we have that more than the other disciplines. I think that's more, we can show people their beauty despite of the body breaking down or the psychology or the mind. We show them their beauty, their humanity, which is always beautiful. It's in the image of God, you know.
And that's what is the most challenging, is when you talk to someone who they've had a negative self-image because of the way that their loved ones have been portraying them and spewing negative, stereotypes or views of them, and then it became internalized. So I had two instances where, family members had always put them down, and they've always mistreated them. And the person was, when their loved one was dying, all that stuff was coming to the surface, either because of the patient themselves was abusive towards them, and that's how they saw themselves, or because of other family members would make fun of them being too sentimental or too emotional about the patient dying. And I had to put a stop to the self-deprecation and say, listen, you're special, you're unique, you're lovely in God's eyes, you have a lot to offer. And it wasn't just empty platitudes. It was really heartfelt, viewing them with the eyes of God. And I think that that's something that gives people a realization that they call it religious anthropology, that our view of humanity is different because we have that impetus to honor the sacred within them. And in other fields, they might not feel comfortable doing that. But I've heard very spiritual doctors say, this is now in God's hands, or, we're going to let God do his thing or something like that. But it's kind of always hesitating. And I think part of our pastoral authority is to be able to say, no, I know in my heart that you can make it through this, or that, you are unique and special. And without just giving everybody, a trophy, is more like that's why we do what we do, because every life counts. And I think that even in hospice, sometimes it feels like maybe going through the motions, or getting to the point where, it's just, there's so much sickness and there's so much suffering that it becomes our goal is not to dehumanize it, but there's a point where when you're dealing with so much of it, it becomes unbearable.
Yeah, it does. And that's why I think it's so important, if anybody's going to do this work, that you have to become a fiercely hopeful person and be in the practice of hope, because the dark that comes out of this work, if one isn't taking self-care and really integrating it to how you're becoming a better spiritual care provider, it'll pull you down. It'll really pull you down. So you do have to, I don't know of any other way but to become a hopeful. If you're working in a hospice environment, you have to be a person of hope and great, not a person of how do I solve problems, how do I help people, not even fearless. What's going to really help a hospice chaplain is to become hopeful and help people become wise and nesting for death. I don't know of, and listening, asking good questions. I think those are the best skills. I'm not sure why we're not taught these things in seminary, because they would serve us, but we have to become really hopeful. And I mean, I agree with you. I think people have to see their divinity, their own internal. They're not the cancer. They're not the disease that's consuming them. They're not, they cannot, as long as we can help people not identify with that, not identify with the cancer, not identify with depression, not identify with what their mind is doing, but identify with who they are at the very core, which is beautifully human, beautifully divine. If we can be facilitators so that people